Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Sockbot, and today I want to talk about platformers. So I know I talk a lot about platformers, and I know I mentioned them here and there as being my favorite genre of video games, and also as my favorite level to make in Littlebigplanet. But as with a lot of other things on this channel, I kind of want to take what I've talked about here and there and really go more into depth on the things that I think deserve that more depth. So let me know down in the comments if you think there's anything else like that I may have missed thus far. I do have other videos coming kind of similar to this. But other than that, yeah, like the video if you like it, and subscribe if you want to see more of me, or if you just want to satisfy my obvious need for attention. Obviously. Anyways, let's get into it. So today I want to talk about platformers, and I'm going to divide the video, as I often do, to make it more cohesive, into two sections. First, kind of like with one of my previous videos where I talked about flow and work and reward and how that makes a game interesting, which you can watch here. I'll do a card. I want to talk a little bit about the history of platformers, why they exist, and kind of briefly go over what makes a platformer a good platformer, and then kind of transform that into Littlebigplanet and what makes Littlebigplanet a good platformer, at least the Sackboy levels, and kind of go into depth with that. And don't worry, I will mention Dreams a little bit too, because I'm prepping these videos that you might watch when Dreams is out, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so brief history, let's start. So what were the original platformers? Well, the original ones that we've talked about before were like Super Mario Brothers and Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong, and even Sonic the Hedgehog. I'll get to those in a second, but before I do, where did those come from? Because it seems like a lot of games are made to be like a fulfillment of some fantasy that you can't really get to in the real world. I know that a lot of games do provide that in the sense of magic or some sign of superpower, and that's obviously based on previous things that have done that, like comic books and like novels that have given that sort of fantasy aspect that really enthralls somebody into reading it, because they don't see that in the real world. And that happens in video games too. I mean, Skyrim lets you shoot people with giant fireballs, and Call of Duty lets you participate in World War II, minus the PTSD and, you know, a lot of death and sadness, but like, at least it shows a good story, and you get to kill Nazis, and I think everybody can agree that killing Nazis is fun, or was fun. Anyways, too political. We'll get into that another time. So, starting with those, they seem pretty obvious. It's fulfilling a fantasy that you can't do in real life. But with platformers, where is that fantasy? Like, did parkour exist a lot of time before the Mario Brothers came out? I don't really think it did. I mean, to be perfectly honest, there wasn't really a whole lot that inspired that sort of thing. Platformers just kind of appeared. It may not be based in parkour, but I feel like they are a very raw aspect of the work reward system I talked about before. Because when you're playing a game like Sonic the Hedgehog and you're constantly going through a level, if you fail it a couple times, and you're making every jump, you're constantly working, meaning trying to get better at skill, trying to know where the leap off point is, where you will land on the other side, and how to stop, and how to jump between platforms and use bounce pads in Sonic. You're always doing that. So you're always doing constant little bits of work for constant little bits of reward, until a bigger reward, like, for example, the end of a Sonic level when you get closer to defeating Dr. Eggman. Now, I'll get to that in a second, but the issue here with Sonic the Hedgehog, for example, is that flow is so fast and so great that it works super well until you hit something, until you hit an enemy, until you fall down a hole, and that just kills it. That kills that flow, that kills the immersion that the flow causes, and that is just very apparent in Sonic the Hedgehog. A more modern version of that is Mirror's Edge, and this was actually docked a lot of points in ratings for it, and I have my reservations about ratings, but I kind of think this is fair, because every time you're killing it in Mirror's Edge, when you're doing great, it's super fun, but there's just such a break from that immersion when you fail in Mirror's Edge, just like there is in Sonic the Hedgehog, that it kind of makes it frustrating, and it makes it less fun and less immersive, and, well, that's a big issue with a game like that. Now, I'm going to get into a more modern game. I want to talk about Super Meat Boy, because if you haven't played Super Meat Boy, it is the best platformer I have downloaded, like on Xbox Live Arcade or whatever originally it was on, and it is absolutely wonderful. I think it's one of the best platformers of the last 10 years, including the Mario games in that top 10. But you can argue with that. I just want to talk about the mechanics of it, because it does do really fast platforming really well, and I could probably argue that it is more difficult than some of the original Sonic the Hedgehogs, even though they may have gotten pretty difficult at times, but it does it really well. You have that flow from Sonic where you're moving fast, you're jumping off walls in this case, and you're killing it, and that gets super fun. But unlike Sonic the Hedgehog and Mirror's Edge, when you fail, you just restart a couple seconds earlier. And the reason for that is every level is like 6 or 10 seconds. It's basically like getting a checkpoint in Sonic every 6 to 10 seconds. And that helps the pacing of it a lot. Now, obviously, it's going to take 50 tries to get that one section done because it's super hard. But there's not as much frustration because the second you die, you can start again. If you die again, you can start again. And you can keep doing that. And it's not like when you die 5 seconds into a level, you really feel that bad about it. Obviously, it can get frustrating. Every game can get frustrating. But I think it does do that very, very well. So now I'm going to move into Littlebigplanet, and this is kind of a weird territory, because Littlebigplanet, based on those kinds of flow things, doesn't seem like a great platformer because it's so slow-paced and because you have even more control over your character. With that many options, other than just moving and jumping and wall jumping, for example, it's much more difficult to focus and get into that flow of perfect platforming like a lot of other games have come close to. But what Littlebigplanet offers that other games don't is the inclusion of other genres. Now, a lot of games are described as puzzle platformers, but I think Littlebigplanet does this extra well because all of these platformer things are great, but the puzzles in Littlebigplanet are only possible because you can grab and because it's slower and you have more control over your character. You can kick to move things faster or move the swingy sponge thing faster, or you can grab onto things in the first place. It's a lot more control that may kind of make the platforming section a little bit more slow, and being able to manipulate yourself in midair is like a little bit more complicated, but it lets all these puzzle elements be introduced. And of course, the basic of those puzzles is like moving this sponge thing to point B to open a door. It's not super advanced all the time, but it is very interesting. And then they built on top of that in later games. So at the end of Littlebigplanet 1, or maybe it was early on, I don't remember, they introduced the Metal Gear Solid pack, which had the Paintinator. So that kind of shifts it more into like adventure action platformer. And that's super interesting. On top of that, in Littlebigplanet 2, they introduced the Controlinator, which is a whole nother game because it just creates a whole nother game. But on top of that, they introduced the head thing. What's the head thing that shoots things? That. And then in Littlebigplanet 3, they introduced entire power-ups for Sackboy. All of this together just adds on top of the platformer aspect. So even though Littlebigplanet's platforming sections may be slightly more basic, and even some of them aren't very basic, some of them are very difficult, but it may not be as fast-paced and it may not nail that flow as well, but it allows you to stay in the game as Sackboy goes from jumping between platforms to moving sponge to shooting giant metal tanks. And it just all works together. Now, there is an exception here in Littlebigplanet 3 because it is very sectional, and it actually ends up working pretty well. So you have the new characters in Littlebigplanet 3, and Oddsock is in himself or herself a return to source, because Oddsock is totally based on that like Sonic the Hedgehog platforming, totally flow, but at the same time it falls victim to the same kind of issues where if you're running and doing all these things perfectly as Oddsock, but then you hit a wall or you hit an enemy or you're not going fast enough to make it around a loop, it can really affect that immersion. But at the same time, it doesn't punish you as hard, and then it's not that hard in the first place, so it's pretty much on a sliding scale here, but I think it does pretty well for a return to source to basic platforming. On the other hand, the other two do it slightly differently. So Toggle, the one that's the big one and the small one, is very puzzle based. You use those big and small things to fix puzzles. You're not trying to sprint through something for any sort of time limit or any sort of perfect jumps. It's just not part of his play. But when you move on to Swoop, it does exactly what Oddsock does in a different way. So Swoop, the whole point of swooping is to maintain that flow, to stop you from having to flap up for a little bit or slowly flap down into a crevice just to go back up. That swooping is perfect flow. If you swoop well, that's the work, and you make it to the other side, it just feels great, and it feels immersive, and it feels tight control. It's just great. So those things are done very well, and I think those even further make up for the issues that a lot of people had with Littlebigplanet being a slower platformer, or more focused on puzzles, or the gravity being kind of floaty, which I will totally do an issue-based video on that, but we'll get to that down the road. Anyways, that is basically all I wanted to talk about today, except for one final thing. When you're making a platformer yourself, if you're super into it like me, it's important to think about these kinds of things when you're making that level. Like, not just thinking of, okay, I'm going to place all this stuff here because it's going to be a difficult challenge. thinking of, okay, if this jump is really hard to make and it's the only one in the series that's super hard, maybe it's not really worth adding to ruin that kind of flow. And on top of that, adding things that maybe aren't difficult but really keep that flow going. You can see that a lot in the base campaign, where there's a lot of like swoopy things even when you're not playing swoop, or like slides, or the skateboard, for example. It's all just very simple things that don't really interrupt the gameplay but keep that flow going. Hope you're all doing well. I will talk to you very soon, and thank you so much for watching my video. Alright, bye guys. Bye. Bye. Bye.